The first thing I noticed was the roof. It was dark gray metal, pitched like a small bus shelter, and it was sitting in the exact space where I had turned my car around every morning for 11 years. Under it stood 2 walls of parcel lockers, a waist-high shelf for oversized boxes, and 4 black steel bollards set into a fresh concrete pad. The entire thing looked permanent because it was permanent. The concrete was already cured. The posts were bolted down. A neat blue sign read Cedar Ridge Package Pavilion, as if naming it made the location reasonable. My garage door was open behind me. My crossover was inside, facing forward. I could pull out. What I could no longer do was swing across the hammerhead at the end of my driveway and turn toward the street. Half of that maneuvering space was now concrete, steel, and lockers. Denise Carver, our HOA president, was standing beside the pavilion with a paper cup in one hand and a ring of keys in the other. It came out nicely, don't you think? She asked. I looked at the 4 bollards. Then I looked at the garage. How am I supposed to turn around? She gave me the kind of patient smile people use when they have decided your question is smaller than their answer. The community voted for a centralized delivery solution. You can still use your driveway. Technically, she was right. There was a strip of pavement between my garage and the street. I could drive through it. By that definition, a hallway with a refrigerator in the middle is still a hallway. What Denise did not mention was that one entire bank of lockers was still wrapped in cloudy protective film. The screen was dark. There was no activation sticker inside the glass panel, only an empty rectangle where one should have been. 6 weeks later, I watched a crew lift that same locker bank onto a flatbed while Denise sat inside the clubhouse answering questions about a site file she had spent most of the summer refusing to show anyone. The pavilion did eventually open. It just did not open across my driveway. To understand how we reached that point, you have to understand the shape of my property and why the HOA thought I would eventually give in. I live in Cedar Ridge, a subdivision built in 3 phases outside Raleigh. My house sits near the original entrance, where the main lane curves past a strip of landscaping and continues toward the clubhouse. The driveway is 18 feet wide. Near the garage, it widens into a hammerhead turning pad. It is not decorative. The street narrows near the entrance, and backing into it during the morning rush is awkward. The hammerhead lets me pull out of the garage, turn once on my own pavement, and enter the lane facing forward. I bought the house 11 years earlier. Before closing, I had checked the recorded site plan, the same way I checked the delivery yards I managed during most of my career. I was a regional operations supervisor for a home delivery company. I did not design roads. I did not stamp engineering plans. My job was much more ordinary. I looked at loading zones, turning paths, delivery windows, gate codes, damaged package reports, and all the small failures that happen when somebody draws a route on paper without watching a van actually drive it. That experience made me particular about access, but it did not make me suspicious of every HOA project. Cedar Ridge had a real package problem. Delivery drivers left boxes under mailboxes, beside garage doors, and sometimes at the wrong house entirely. 2 holiday packages disappeared the previous December. One contained a child's tablet. Another contained prescription supplies that had to be replaced. Residents had asked for a secure pickup point, and I had supported the idea when it first appeared in a community survey. The clubhouse had a wide common area parking lot. There was also an unused strip beside the maintenance shed. Either location could handle resident traffic without sending strangers onto private property. Denise wanted the pavilion near the entrance. She called it a premium arrival amenity. The developer still owned 6 lots in the final phase, and a sales weekend was scheduled for late summer. A covered wall of new lockers near the front of the neighborhood looked better in a brochure than one beside a maintenance shed. The problem was that the most visible flat surface near the entrance was my turning pad. Denise came to my house on a Tuesday evening with a folder and a member of the management company named Allison Park. They sat at my kitchen table while Denise explained that the pavilion would be placed adjacent to the Reed Drive. That phrase sounded careful. It became less careful when she slid a 2-page document across the table. The title was Access Acknowledgement and Maintenance Understanding. It allowed Cedar Ridge residents, delivery carriers, contractors, and maintenance personnel to enter and use my turning pad from 6 in the morning until 10 at night. It had no expiration date. It said the HOA would maintain the pavilion, but I would remain responsible for the condition of the underlying driveway. It also waived claims for ordinary interruption, noise, surface wear, and delivery traffic. "This is not an acknowledgement," I said. "This is permanent access." Allison looked down at her copy. Denise kept smiling. "It formalizes what the developer always intended," she said. "There's a circulation path on the original community plan." I asked whether the HOA believed it already controlled the driveway. "We believe the plan gives the association the access it needs." "Then why do you need my signature?" That was the first moment the room became quiet. I did not raise my voice. I told them I supported a package pavilion, but I would not give hundreds of people daily access to a private turning pad while remaining responsible for the pavement. I pointed out the clubhouse lot and the maintenance shed strip. I even offered to review the delivery approach with the vendor as long as the pavilion stayed on common property. Denise closed the folder. "The entrance location has already been selected," she said. "Your cooperation would make this easier." The next morning, I sent an email summarizing the conversation. I declined the acknowledgement. I listed the 2 alternative locations. I asked the board not to authorize work affecting my driveway without a recorded right or my written consent. Denise replied with 3 sentences. "Thank you for your input. The board has authority to complete approved community improvements. The developer's original circulation plan confirms association control of the selected area." I printed the email and put it beside my closing documents. A week later, bright paint appeared along the edge of my turning pad. Utility marking flags followed. At first, the marks stayed in the grass. Then a white rectangle crossed the pavement and took in nearly half the hammerhead. I photographed it before anyone moved a shovel. The contractor arrived on a Thursday with a compact loader, lumber for forms, and a pallet of base stone. I met the foreman near the garage. His name was Luis. I showed him my closing site plan and Denise's email. I told him I disputed the HOA's authority to build on the turning pad and asked him to stop until someone verified the site. Luis did stop. He was not rude or defensive. He read the first page, took 2 photographs with his phone, and called his office. For almost 40 minutes, nothing moved. Then a white SUV from the management company arrived. Allison handed Luis a work order packet. He read it, made another call, and told me he had been directed to continue. "How is the location described?" I asked. He hesitated, then turned the cover page just far enough for me to read the bold line under seat. HOA-controlled circulation area north entrance. That description was doing a lot of work. I took 1 photograph of the cover page from where I stood. I took another of the untouched pavement, the forms stacked in the grass, and the painted rectangle. I did not stand in front of the loader. I did not pull out the flags. I sent a written objection to the board, management, and the contractor's public office address. The work continued. By sunset, the topsoil beside my driveway was gone. The first forms were in place. Denise drove past slowly on her way home and lifted 2 fingers from the steering wheel in a small wave. At that point, I still thought the board might pause before concrete. I had given them the closing plan. The contractor had called management. The 2 alternative sites were still available. What I did not know was that the board had already decided the cost of stopping would be more embarrassing than the cost of pushing me. The concrete was poured the following Tuesday. I was not home when the trucks arrived. My sister had an appointment across town, and I had promised to drive her. The timing was not a conspiracy. Concrete crews work when they are scheduled, and my appointment had been on the calendar for weeks. Still, it meant the most permanent part of the installation happened during the 4 hours I was away. When I returned, the forms enclosed a rectangle 18 feet by 26 feet. 9 feet of that pad lay across the turning area. I knew those numbers because the contractor's layout marks were still visible and because the dimensions appeared on the small job placard wired to the fence. I photographed the placard once. I did not spend the afternoon measuring from 6 angles. The physical problem was already obvious. The concrete carried a project number, PP17. Denise was there with Allison, looking at the wet surface. "You poured over the turning pad after receiving my objection," I said. Denise looked at the concrete as if it answered for her. The board relied on the community circulation plan. At this point, stopping would waste association funds. That was the first time she used the money already spent as proof that the decision had been correct. I asked for the approved site drawing, not the rendering residents had seen, but the drawing the contractor used to locate the slab. Allison said she would check the portal. Nothing appeared that week. The pavilion rose quickly after that. Steel columns went up at the corners. A dark roof arrived in sections. 2 locker modules were set beneath it by a small crane, followed by a shelf for boxes too large for the compartments. The installers left the locker screens covered. 4 bollards were drilled into the pad along the driveway side, each one positioned to protect the new equipment from vehicles. They also protected the new equipment from my ability to use my own turning space. The first time I tried to leave after the bollards went in, I set a phone on a shelf inside the garage and recorded the maneuver. I pulled forward at the same angle I had used for years. My front end cleared the first bollard. The rear did not have enough room to complete the swing. I stopped, backed once, adjusted, backed a second time, then eased toward the street. I could get out. That was never the question. The question was whether the driveway still performed the function it had been built to perform. That afternoon, a courier van followed the new blue Pavilion sign. The driver turned into my driveway, saw the dark locker screen, and stopped. With the Pavilion on one side and my garage on the other, he could not turn the van around. He reversed toward the entrance lane while another car waited on the curve. Nothing crashed. Nobody jumped out of the way. It was the quieter kind of failure that route managers see every day. A driver forced into a bad maneuver because the site was designed on paper for a vehicle that never actually tested it. My doorbell camera captured the entire reversal. The next morning, I placed 3 removable orange cones at the private edge of the driveway. They did not block the sidewalk or the street. Their only purpose was to keep drivers from mistaking my pavement for the Pavilion approach. I also began leaving my crossover on the street overnight, facing out, because I did not want to perform the multi-point turn in darkness every morning. The HOA responded before the lockers did. I received 1 violation for unauthorized exterior objects. The cones had to be removed within 48 hours. A second notice cited overnight street parking, even though the curb was not marked and the HOA had rarely enforced that rule except during snow events. Each notice carried a daily fine after the cure period. I appealed both through the portal. I included a photograph of the obstructed turning pad and asked the board to suspend enforcement until normal access was restored. Denise answered by email that the pavilion did not prevent vehicle access and that my parking choices did not excuse rule violations. 2 hours later, she sent a second email marked confidential settlement communication. If I signed the access acknowledgement, she wrote, the board would suspend the cone violation, waive the street parking fines, and coordinate reasonable edge repairs after installation. The two messages told the story more clearly together than either one did alone. In public, my access problem did not exist. In private, the board was willing to make the consequences disappear if I signed the document that had started the dispute. I saved both messages with their timestamps. Neighbors were not immediately on my side. That matters because stories about HOA disputes often make the entire community recognize the villain by the second meeting. Real neighborhoods do not work that way. Most residents wanted secure package delivery. They had seen the pavilion roof going up. They had paid an assessment contribution toward it. From the street, my driveway still looked open. Some people assumed I objected because I did not want residents near my house. I understood that. If the only information I had seen was the board newsletter, I might have believed the same thing. At the next monthly meeting, Denise presented a full-color rendering on the clubhouse screen. It showed the pavilion resting in a landscaped pocket near the entrance. A pale path curved toward it. The nearest driveway appeared several yards away. In the rendering, no concrete crossed any private turning pad, and no bollards interfered with a vehicle. Denise described me as the adjacent homeowner and said the board was working through minor concerns. When public comments opened, I carried one sheet of paper to the front. I did not show the doorbell video. I did not accuse anyone of falsifying a plan. I asked 4 questions. What was the drawing number? What was the revision date? Did the board have a final site acceptance drawing? Where was the owner authorization record for the pavement under the installed pad? Denise said the vendor had approved the location. Then the approval should have a number, I said. Allison zoomed in on the rendering to look for one. At the bottom right, in letters too small to see from the back rows, was a footer. See Exhibit P2. No one gasped. Denise did not turn pale. A few residents leaned forward. One man asked what preliminary meant. Denise said it was standard design language and moved to the next agenda item. After the meeting, a woman named Carol Bennett stopped beside me in the parking lot. Carol had served as HOA treasurer 3 years earlier. She remembered reviewing a different estimate for lockers near the clubhouse because delivery vans already used that parking lot. It was less visible, she said. Denise hated that part. I asked whether Carol still had the board packet. She said she might have it in an old email archive. The following day, I submitted a formal records request. I asked for the pavilion contract, all site exhibits, the minutes approving the site, any owner consent record, vendor clearance requirements, change orders, work orders, and payment approvals. Management sent me the same preliminary rendering Denise had shown at the meeting. Allison said the vendor contract and internal communications were confidential. I read our state's planned community records provision, but I did not turn my email into a legal lecture. Instead, I narrowed the request. I asked only for the documents the board relied upon when it voted for the installed location, and the documents management relied upon when it issued the work order describing my driveway as association-controlled. That was harder to dismiss as a fishing expedition. The narrowed request also forced me to decide what I was actually trying to prove. It is easy to collect everything when you are angry. Every newsletter begins to look suspicious. Every old violation feels connected. That kind of pile may feel impressive at a kitchen table, but it makes it harder for anyone else to see the sequence. I started a one-page chronology instead. On the first line, I put the date Denise asked for the access acknowledgement. On the second, my written refusal and the two alternate sites. Then the paint marks, the contractor pause, the revised work order, the concrete pour, the bollards, the courier reversal, and the fines. Beside each event, I wrote the document or image that could verify it. If a statement was only my memory, I labeled it that way. That exercise exposed a weakness in my own position. I knew the driveway belonged with my lot because of the closing plan, but I did not yet know what the Pavilion vendor had been told. I also did not know whether the board had received a final drawing different from the rendering. If I started accusing Denise of knowingly submitting false information, I would be jumping ahead of my evidence. So I stopped using the word illegal, even in private messages. I described the installation as disputed, unverified, or inconsistent with the closing plan. Those words were less satisfying. They were also accurate. The neighborhood discussion became harder to control. Someone posted a photograph of my cones in the Cedar Ridge resident group and wrote that one homeowner was delaying package security for everyone. A few replies said I should be grateful the Pavilion would increase property values. Another resident asked why the HOA had built first if it still needed my signature. I did not upload my entire file. I posted one sentence: I support a secure pavilion on HOA-controlled common property and have proposed 2 available sites. Then I logged out. The next evening, a neighbor named Jonah knocked on my door. He had defended the entrance location at the meeting because his wife ran a home business and lost packages regularly. He wanted to see whether my vehicle was truly blocked. I showed him the driveway without performing another demonstration. I pointed to the garage, the hammerhead edge, and the first bollard. Jonah walked the turn himself, tracing the space with his eyes. "But you can back out," he said. "I can," I said. "So can a courier van. The question is whether either of us can leave facing forward the way this site is supposed to allow." He looked at the entrance curve, where 2 cars passed close together. Jonah did not announce that he had changed sides. He said he still wanted the lockers and left. At the next meeting, however, he asked Denise whether the clubhouse option had been priced. That was the first sign the issue might move from Marcus versus the HOA to one location versus another. Management answered my narrowed request on the 10th business day, the last day in the response window they had cited. The timing was frustrating but ordinary. There was no midnight leak and no sympathetic insider sliding an envelope under my door. 14 pages appeared in the portal because the question had become specific enough that the records could no longer be replaced by a rendering. While I waited, the fines began to accumulate. I removed the cones before the deadline because I did not want the dispute to become about whether I ignored a direct notice. I left a small sign inside my property line that read "Private Drive, Pavilion not active." Couriers still entered twice that week. The lockers remained dark. Denise announced in the newsletter that activation would occur upon completion of routine vendor programming. She also announced a ribbon cutting for the developer's upcoming sales weekend. I went back to the photograph of the slab placard and looked at the project number. CRPP 17 was the first piece of information in the entire dispute that came from neither the HOA nor me. The company name on the placard belonged to Meridian Parcel Systems. I called the public number on its website and told the coordinator exactly who I was, the owner of property adjacent to Project PP17, with a question about final site acceptance. I did not ask her to decide ownership. I did not tell her the HOA had committed fraud. I asked what normally had to happen before a new pavilion was activated. Her name was Priya Shah. She was careful, which I respected. She could not discuss the association's contract with me, but she could explain Meridian's standard process. First came a preliminary concept showing the proposed location. Then the client confirmed control of the site and provided any required owner authorization. Meridian reviewed the approach for residents, service technicians, and delivery vehicles. Installation followed. After installation, a facilities reviewer performed a final site visit. Only then did Meridian issue an acceptance certificate and activate the locker network. So installation and activation are separate? I asked. Always, Priya said. The final condition has to match the accepted packet. I gave her the project number. There was a pause while she typed. A final visit is already on the schedule, she said. I can't provide the client details, but the site is not in active status. That explained the dark screen without requiring a secret technical failure. The board had built the structure before passing the last gate. Priya gave me an email address where affected property owners could submit site information for the reviewer. I did not send anything immediately. At that point, I knew the procedure, but I still needed to understand what the board had submitted. Carol called 2 days later. She had found the old packet. We met at the clubhouse during open office hours. Her copy included the early estimate for the clubhouse parking lot and a second option near the maintenance shed, the same 2 places I had suggested. It also included a developer-era map I recognized from the welcome materials given to early buyers. A dashed line curved from the entrance across the area where my driveway would eventually be built. The line was labeled Circulation Concept. In the corner, a note read Conceptual Illustration Only. Not for ownership, permitting, or construction. The map was created before the final lots were recorded and before my house existed. It showed possible vehicle movement through an undeveloped phase. It did not grant anyone permanent access to finished private property. I compared it with Denise's first email. She had called it the developer's original circulation plan and said it confirmed association control. The work order had turned that claim into HOA-controlled circulation area. The words had become more certain each time they moved to a new document. Carol also found meeting notes showing the board had preferred the clubhouse location at first. Meridian's preliminary comment on that option was positive. Denise postponed the vote because she wanted a location visible from the entrance before the developer sales weekend. The maintenance shed site was rejected for the same reason. It looked ordinary. None of that proved the entrance site had failed. It did prove the board knew there were viable alternatives on common land. My narrowed records request produced a response that afternoon. Allison sent 14 pages. Most were invoices and routine approvals, but 3 pages mattered. The first was a message from Luis's project manager to Allison, sent before the concrete pour. The field layout appears to cross an existing residential drive. Please confirm association site control or provide written owner authorization before placement. Allison forwarded it to Denise. Denise replied, Developer circulation exhibit confirms association control. Owner objection is noted but does not change approved community use. Proceed under board authorization. No deed, owner signature, or final site drawing was attached. The second page was a work order revision using the same phrase I had seen on the cover sheet. The third was an invoice tied to project P17 and a document labeled P2. The contractor had not invented the site description. It had asked a reasonable question and received a confident answer. I added the email chain to the chronology. I still did not call it fraud. A person can be wrong, overconfident, and procedurally reckless without secretly plotting a crime. Denise believed the board's vote, and the developer illustration gave her enough authority. The problem was that every professional downstream had asked for something more specific, and she had answered with the same assumption. That evening, Denise came to my door without Allison. She had a revised proposal. The HOA would waive all fines. I would receive a reserved oversized locker. The association would pay for a reasonable cosmetic repair along the pavilion pad. In exchange, I would sign the access acknowledgement retroactively and agree not to challenge the installed location. "You would get everything you asked for," she said. I looked past her at the pavilion. A courier was standing under the roof, pressing the dark screen as if more pressure might wake it up. "I asked for my driveway to function," I said. "The pavilion would still be there. You can maneuver around it. I can perform a 3-point correction around it. Delivery vans can't." Denise told me I was turning a community improvement into a personal campaign. For a moment, her offer was tempting. Not because of the reserved locker, but because the fines would stop and the daily argument would become quiet. I could sign, park in my garage, and learn to live with the turn. Most disputes survive because the cost of ending them privately is lower than the cost of correcting them publicly. But my signature would do more than settle a disagreement. It would retroactively supply the one thing the contractor had asked for and the board did not have. It would transform a disputed construction decision into something I had accepted. I declined the offer in writing the next morning. I did not threaten to sue. I wrote that I would cooperate with a neutral site review and any solution that restored the original driveway function while placing the pavilion on property the HOA controlled. That choice delayed relief, but it also simplified the story. From then on, I was not negotiating for a better private deal. I was waiting for the installation to pass or fail the same process any site should pass. While we waited for Meridian's visit, I kept a 7-day route log. It was one page, not a binder. I recorded the time whenever a resident tried the inactive lockers, a courier entered the driveway, or I had to make the multi-point turn. I noted the morning and evening periods when cars queued near the entrance. On Saturday, I asked Carol to witness one controlled demonstration. I mounted one camera inside the garage at hood height and left the doorbell camera in its usual position. I placed removable markers at the existing pavement edge, not as a protest, but so the reviewer could see the available space. I drove the same crossover from the same garage position. The front cleared the first bollard. The rear turning path did not. I stopped before touching anything, backed twice, and exited. We filmed it once. There was no dramatic near collision. That was the point. The problem did not need an accident to be real. A site can fail because it requires ordinary drivers to perform a blind or awkward maneuver every time they use it. I sent Priya 4 items: the closing site plan, the preliminary rendering with its P2 footer, the contractor's authorization question, and the 7-day route log with the single demonstration video. I asked Meridian to keep the system inactive until its reviewer could compare the installed footprint with the submitted site information. Priya acknowledged receipt and copied Allison. In that email, she summarized the conditions Meridian would verify: client control of the installation pad, any required owner authorization, a clear resident approach, and adequate service and delivery access. She emphasized that Meridian's reviewer would evaluate operational acceptance, not adjudicate property ownership. That distinction mattered. I did not need Meridian to declare that I owned the pavement. My closing plan already described my lot. I needed Meridian to decide whether its own equipment could be activated at a site with disputed control and a blocked turning path. Denise responded within an hour. She said my submission contained unverified homeowner measurements and accused me of interfering with an HOA contract. Priya replied to both of us that the final review would use Meridian's standard vehicle template and installed site measurements. My video would be treated only as context. That was exactly what I wanted. The final site visit was scheduled for the Friday before the developer sales weekend. Denise had already advertised a Saturday ribbon cutting. The newsletter called activation a routine programming step and invited residents to bring children for refreshments. That schedule created another problem the board had not discussed publicly. Residents had begun changing their delivery preferences based on the promised opening date. Some redirected packages to the new Pavilion address printed in the newsletter. Because the system was inactive, those labels did not open a locker assignment. Couriers called recipients, left boxes at doors, or carried them back to the terminal. The Pavilion was not merely failing to solve package confusion. The premature announcement was creating a second layer of it. I added only confirmed examples to the route log. Jonah forwarded a carrier notice showing his parcel had been returned for an invalid locker destination. Carol documented a driver asking where to leave 3 oversized boxes. I did not count complaints copied from social media because I could not verify them. At the next open board hour, I asked Allison to cover the Pavilion direction sign until activation. She agreed the sign was attracting drivers but said Denise wanted it visible for the sales weekend. Allison offered a compromise, a small not yet active strip beneath the larger arrow. The strip went up the next day. It helped residents walking to the lockers. Drivers approaching from a van could not read it until they had already turned into my driveway. That detail mattered later because it showed the operational failure was not theoretical and not entirely hidden from management. Allison had recognized the problem and attempted a partial fix. Denise's motivation also remained understandable. She wanted the amenity to look ready because the developer had scheduled buyers to tour the entrance. The same deadline that made the Pavilion valuable made verification feel, to her, like sabotage. I sent Priya a photograph of the amended sign and added one sentence to my submission. Client has acknowledged premature routing, but signage still directs vehicles into the disputed approach. I did not ask Meridian to cancel the project. I asked the reviewer to see the site as drivers were actually encountering it. For the first time, the board's deadline and the vendor's gate were on a collision course. Denise doubled down. Decorative planters appeared near the Pavilion, hiding the unfinished edge of the slab from the entrance. A banner went up between 2 posts. My portal account showed a final demand for the cone and street parking fines, even though the cones had been removed. The notice gave me 10 days to pay or request a hearing. I requested the hearing and attached no new argument. I simply wrote that the parking condition resulted from the Pavilion installation and that final site acceptance remained pending. The next morning, I found a small card taped to the dark locker screen. Ribbon cutting. 10 a.m. underneath. The activation indicator was still blank. Meridian's reviewer arrived Friday morning in a compact white van. Her name was Elena Ruiz. She wore a reflective vest, carried a tablet, and introduced herself to Allison, Denise, Luis, and me before she opened any drawings. A delivery driver turned into my driveway while we were standing there. He had seen the Pavilion sign and assumed the lockers were active. I stepped to the side of the driveway, waved him to a stop before he reached the bollards, and pointed him toward the clubhouse parking lot where he could turn safely. Denise tried to begin explaining the dispute as soon as the van left. Elena held up one hand. Let me document the operating condition first. That sentence set the tone for the entire review. She photographed the entrance approach, the Pavilion, the 4 bollards, the garage, and the turning pad. She scanned the project number. On her tablet, she opened Exhibit P2 and compared the rendered planting pocket with the actual concrete footprint. Then she asked Allison for the final site authorization record. Allison handed her the board work order. Elena asked whether there was a property owner authorization separate from the work order. Denise said the developer circulation plan established association use. Elena did not debate that. I'm asking what is in the Meridian site packet. There was no separate authorization. She measured the installed pad. 18 feet by 26. She measured the portion extending into the hammerhead, 9 feet. She measured the remaining paved area and marked the bollard positions on her tablet. The numbers were the same ones visible from the contractor's layout and the same ones I had recorded after the pour. Nothing changed because a climax had arrived. Elena then loaded Meridian's standard service vehicle template. It was not a real truck. It was a digital turning overlay tied to her measurements. She asked me to place my crossover in its normal garage position and perform the maneuver I had shown in the video. I did. Front around the first bollard. Stop. Reverse. Adjust. Reverse again. Elena watched from the driveway edge. Luis watched the rear wheel path. Carol stood farther back with 2 other residents. Denise remained beside the pavilion sign. Can a car physically exit? Denise asked when I reached the street. Yes, Elena said. That is not the acceptance question. She explained that Meridian's clearance standard considered the normal approach for residents, delivery vans, and service access. A site did not pass merely because a small vehicle could escape after corrections. It had to match the accepted layout and provide the operational access represented in the packet. Elena went back to her van for 15 minutes. When she returned, she asked everyone to gather under the pavilion roof. I cannot issue final site acceptance today, she said. She listed 3 unresolved items. First, the packet identified the HOA as controlling the installation pad, but the closing site plan and owner objection created a site control discrepancy that the client had not resolved with an authorization document. Second, the installed pavilion did not provide the clear approach and turning path shown in Meridian site requirements. Third, the installed footprint did not match the location depicted on preliminary Exhibit P2. Until those items were cured, Meridian would not activate the lockers or certify the site for service. The ribbon-cutting banner moved slightly in the morning breeze behind her. Denise asked whether the software could be activated temporarily for the sales weekend. No, Elena said. The site has not been accepted. There was no shouting. The locker doors did not spring open and reveal a secret. The screen simply remained dark, which suddenly meant something every resident standing there could understand. The board had paid for a finished-looking structure that the vendor would not operate. Allison canceled the ribbon cutting before lunch. By late afternoon, the board had scheduled an emergency meeting. More residents attended that meeting than any budget session I could remember. Some were angry because they had defended the pavilion. Others wanted to know how much relocation would cost. A few still thought I should sign the acknowledgement so the system could open. I did not begin with my opinion. I put the documents in order on the screen. First, my written refusal and the 2 common area alternatives. Second, the preliminary rendering labeled P2. Third, the conceptual developer illustration with the warning that it was not for ownership or construction. Fourth, the contractor's request for owner authorization. Fifth, Denise's instruction to proceed under board authority. Sixth, Meridian's final site rejection. Each document answered a different question. The closing plan described my lot. The preliminary exhibit showed what the board wanted the project to look like. The contractor email showed someone had raised the ownership issue before the pour. The vendor rejection showed the installed site did not meet the conditions for activation. Denise argued that the board had acted in good faith based on the developer's original intent. That was possible. Good faith, however, did not create the missing authorization or clear the turning path. Luis's project manager joined by video. He confirmed that the contractor had requested owner authorization and proceeded only after management issued the revised work order. Meridian's contract manager confirmed that P2 was preliminary and that activation depended on final acceptance. Allison confirmed that Denise had directed the disputed location after the clubhouse alternative was set aside. Nobody needed to call anyone a liar. The responsibility chain closed through ordinary records. The board's attorney did not threaten me or announce a dramatic legal defeat. She advised the directors that they now had written notice of a disputed private site, an inactive vendor system, and an operational access failure. Continuing to occupy the pavement without a cure increased the association's exposure and did not move the pavilion any closer to activation. Meridian offered two contractual options. The first was a cure. The HOA could relocate the equipment to a site it controlled, submit the revised approach plan, restore the affected driveway, and schedule a new final inspection. The second was termination. Meridian would remove its branded locker equipment, but the HOA would remain responsible for the unused concrete pad, canopy, bollards, and contract charges. Carol asked whether the clubhouse location was still viable. Meridian's manager said it had been viable during preliminary review and could be reevaluated quickly because the parking lot already had a service approach. That changed the room. Residents were not choosing between me and secure packages. They were choosing between a working pavilion on common land and a dead pavilion on disputed pavement. The board voted 4-1 to relocate it. Denise cast the only vote against. The relocation did not happen the next morning. The HOA had to approve a scope, schedule the equipment crew, confirm utilities at the clubhouse, and allow the repair materials to cure. That delay made the correction more believable and more frustrating. For another 12 days, the pavilion remained across my turning pad, but the pressure had changed direction. The fines were suspended. Couriers were redirected. A temporary sign told residents the pavilion would open at the clubhouse. I reviewed the restoration scope because the first draft said only patch-affected area. I asked for 3 specific things: remove the pavilion concrete that overlapped the turning pad, extract all 4 bollards and their footings, and restore the driveway surface, edge, drainage slope, and finish to the pre-work condition. I was not qualified to approve the mixed design or inspect compaction, so the HOA hired an independent pavement contractor for that work. On relocation day, the same type of small crane that had installed the locker modules returned. Crews disconnected the canopy. They lifted the first locker wall onto a flatbed, then the second. The dark screen passed slowly in front of my garage. Neighbors watched from the sidewalk. Nobody cheered. The structure had cost all of us money. Watching it leave was satisfying because the driveway was coming back, but it was also a clear picture of how expensive certainty becomes when verification happens after construction. Luis's crew cut around the pavilion pad. They did not saw into the original driveway. The independent pavement contractor removed the 9-foot overlap, extracted the bollard bases, rebuilt the edge, and prepared the surface repair. The remaining pavilion foundation outside my pavement was removed after the equipment left. Denise came by once during the work. She stood near the entrance and watched the canopy sections being loaded. "The clubhouse location won't have the same visibility," she said. "It will have parking," I said. That was the only conversation we had that day. By evening, the hammerhead shape was visible again. It looked rough, with fresh aggregate and temporary barriers around the repair. I did not drive over it. The pavement contractor had specified a cure period, and after 6 weeks of arguing about process, I was not going to ignore the first clear instruction that protected my own driveway. The pavilion was gone, but the proof of restoration would come from the same ordinary maneuver that had shown the problem in the first place. The contractor removed the barriers 5 days later. Before I drove over the repair, the pavement inspector checked the edge, surface finish, and slope away from the garage. He documented the restored dimensions and signed the completion sheet. I kept a copy, not because I expected another fight, but because the entire story had started when a temporary-looking assumption was allowed to harden into concrete. Carol stood beside the garage while I mounted the phone in the exact position we had used for the first turning test. The doorbell camera had never moved. I pulled the crossover forward, turned across the hammerhead, and aligned with the driveway in one smooth motion. No reverse. No correction. No front bumper passing inches from a bollard. It was almost disappointing as a visual. The maneuver took a few seconds. That was the point. A functioning driveway should not create drama every time somebody uses it. At the clubhouse, work on the new Pavilion site was already underway. Meridian reused the canopy and locker modules. The HOA did not pay to throw away everything. The revised pad sat beside existing parking, where residents could stop without entering a private driveway. Delivery vans could approach through the lot, turn in the marked service lane, and leave facing forward. The vendor inspected that route before the replacement concrete was poured. When the lockers finally activated, there was no ribbon cutting. A short email told residents their access codes were ready. By the end of the week, the Pavilion was doing exactly what it had been intended to do from the beginning. The board handled my fines at the next regular meeting. The cone violation and street parking charges were rescinded. The association reimbursed the documented restoration expenses that were not already included in the relocation contract. I did not receive a reserved locker, and I did not want one. My name did not appear on any access acknowledgement because I never signed it. The more important changes were less visible. Any HOA capital project involving private property now required written owner consent before the work order could be issued. Site packets had to distinguish authoritative parcel documents from conceptual developer exhibits. Final access review had to occur before construction whenever a project expected residents, vendors, or delivery vehicles to use a new route. Work orders had to identify the document supporting site control instead of repeating a board description. Those rules did not guarantee perfect decisions. They made it harder for confidence to replace verification. Denise remained president until the next election. She did not resign during a dramatic speech, and her life did not collapse. At the annual meeting, she defended the original location as an honest interpretation made under schedule pressure. Several residents accepted that explanation. They still voted for a different president, partly because the board had treated a sales deadline as more important than a documented objection. I was asked to run for the board. I declined. I had spent enough evenings reading meeting packets. Carol agreed to serve on a temporary project review committee, which suited her better than it suited me. For a while, I still slowed down when I backed out of the garage. My hands expected the extra correction even after the bollards were gone. Then one morning I completed the turn without thinking about it at all. That was when the driveway felt like mine again. From the entrance, I could see the Pavilion roof beyond the clubhouse parking lot. It was the same gray metal, the same locker walls, and the same blue Cedar Ridge sign. Moved a few hundred feet, it had gone from an obstacle to a useful amenity. The board's mistake was not wanting secure package delivery. Most of us wanted that. The mistake was treating my driveway as blank space on a rendering and my refusal as a problem to be engineered around. Once the project became expensive, every new document was used to defend the last decision instead of checking whether the first one had been sound. I never found one dramatic paper that won the dispute. The closing plan mattered. The preliminary footer mattered. The contractor's question mattered. The job number mattered. The vendor's activation process mattered. None of them did much alone. In the correct order, they made the outcome difficult to avoid. That is the part I remember whenever I pass the Pavilion now. It is easy to think documentation is passive because paper does not stop a concrete truck. Mine did not. What it did was preserve every choice after the truck left who had raised the question, what answer had been given, which condition remained open, and what had to happen before the project could honestly be called complete. The pavilion eventually opened. The driveway eventually worked. Cedar Ridge got both things, but only after the HOA stopped pretending one had to be sacrificed for the other.